Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekhachari Wagh, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology of Gender. Today we are going to discuss an important module called Constructing Normative Sexuality. In this module, we are going to question the binaries, especially in terms of what is normal and what is abnormal. We will try to understand the different kinds of sexuality which are present in our understanding, and we will also question about the important ideas that we have with regard to sexuality. We will, using the gender lens, we would try to evaluate how we have understood and have kept our minds close to this idea of alternative sexuality. Constructing normative sexuality, homosexuality, heterosexuality and intersex. Conversations about sex and sexuality are invariably intercepted with questions such as what is the need to talk about such dirty, immoral things. Sex is something that happens naturally between men and women after marriage in the darkness of night and in the privacy of their bedrooms. What is the need then to discuss something that is natural, will happen anyway and in the name for way for everyone in a universal manner? So why talk about it? The current module will critically evaluate some of these claims related to sexuality. A. Sex as natural and universal. B. Sex as private matter. C. Sex as compulsorily heterosexual and linked with heterosexual marriage. D. Notions of normal and abnormal and deviant sex. The term sex has been used within sociology in two different contexts. One context is where sex is used to refer to biological differences between male and female, that is referring to visible differences in the external genitalia and associated procreative functions. In this context, sex is viewed as stable and a universal given binary category. This kind of reference to sex is made often to point to the variable nature of gender, wherein sex is seen as a biological given and gender seen as socially constructed, culturally influenced dynamic idea. Several theorists have challenged this kind of sex-gender distinction. For example, West and Zimmerman argues that sex is a socially agreed upon biological criteria for classifying persons as females or males. Queer theorists have questioned the binary description of sex and gender. Butler suggests that both sex and gender are constructed, and in this sense we are not born with a sex but we are assigned a sex at birth. Annie Foster Sterling, in her article 5 Sexes Revisited, states in an ideal biological world, human beings are divided into two kinds of perfectly dimorphic species, male with the XY chromosome and internal plumbing for delivering urine and semen, and females with XX chromosomes, ovaries and all internal plumbing to deliver urine and ova to the world. However, outside this ideal world, in reality, the story is often different. Absolute dimorphism disintegrates even at the level of basic biology. Chromosomes, hormones, internal sex structures of gonads, external genitalia vary very much more in human beings than we realize or than we care to talk about. So in reality, there are many women with facial hair than there are men with none. There are women with a deep voice and men with squeaky ones. Persons born outside absolute dimorphism are referred to as persons with intersex variations. Foster Sterling suggests, based on research data, that the number of intersex births might be as many as 1.7%. Yet we know of such few people or collectives that talks about intersex rights. The primary reason for this seems to lie in the gender binarism firmly established in medical practice and in social realities. Thus, when an intersex infant is born, it is treated as a pediatric emergency, and most infants are operated upon through what is termed as corrective surgeries to alter their biological makeup, external genitals to match that of a male or female child. As a result, most individuals with intersex variations grow up with the gender assigned to them as birth. Some may even have the knowledge that they underwent a minor surgery soon after their birth. Whether these children grow up with a sense of comfort and alignment between their inner sense of gender or felt gender and the one assigned to them at birth, or do they feel the lack of alignment between their felt gender and assigned gender, is clearly not the concern of the parents or the doctors performing these surgeries. In this module, however, I will focus on the other meaning of sex implying sexuality. I will use examples and suggest small group exercises to discuss how not only sex and gender are socially constructed into binaries of male and female, but ideas of normal and abnormal sexuality, that is heterosexuality and homosexuality, are constructed from this very idea of binary nature of sex and gender. Normative heterosexuality can be argued to be a social structure that is upheld by institutions of marriage, family, science and medicine, law and state, religion, and that marginalizes people who do not prescribe to this normative ideal sexuality. Robin, in her essay Thinking Sex Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality, suggests several propositions regarding the political nature of sexuality and builds a compelling argument for social construction of normative sexuality. One of the first propositions that Rubin discusses is that of sexual essentialism. It refers to the idea that sex is natural biological force that exists prior to social life and that shape institutions. It is thus viewed as unchanging, asocial and trans-historical. This idea of sexual essentialism has been reproduced in disciplines of psychiatry, medicine and psychology, which have been some of the dominating disciplines in sex research. These disciplines view sex as a property of individuals as resides within individual hormones and psyches without historical and social determinants. This proposition of a biological psychic origin of sexuality that is uninfluenced by the social milieu and remains static across centuries implies that sexuality is universal and our ideas of acceptable normative sexuality are frozen in time. However, if we look at the history of sexuality, we witness that across different historical contexts and at the same period time in different communities, ideas of normative sex differ widely. Walkowitz argues that the interplay of social forces such as ideology, fear, political agitation, legal reform and medical practice can change the structure of sexual behavior and alter its consequences. Here I take the illustrative example of medicalization of homosexuality in the late 19th century and the early 20th century to discuss the role of social beliefs and political ideology that shape scientific ideas of normality and abnormality. History of medicalization of homosexuality. In the second half of the 19th century, homosexuality, which until then had been a theme in religious and moral discourses, became a subject of inquiry in science and medicine. This led to a large body of work wherein sexologists, psychiatrists, psychologists classified and created a range of sexual perversions and abnormalities in contrast to heterosexuality. Thus, a range of perverse sexualities were labeled and described in order to be able to define the normal form of sexuality. Interestingly, historically, the term homosexual was coined and officially used much more before the term heterosexual came to existence. This was to define that which is abnormal before describing the normal and the normative. Krafft-Ebing was the first one to use the term homosexual as a medical condition that implied deviance and abnormality in his work Psychopathia Sexualis, which viewed human sexual behavior as a collection of terrible diseases. Bieber, after a study of 100 homosexuals and 100 heterosexuals, concluded that homosexual orientation was a result of pathogenic family with a domineering mother and a detached or absent father. George Henry, a psychiatrist, and his committee for the study of sex variants scrutinized homosexual bodies in an effort to document the sex atypicality of the genitals and secondary sex characteristics. Homosexual brains and nervous systems were assumed to have some cross-gendered characteristics. Simon Levy argued that an area of homosexual men's hypothalamus was closer in size to that of the woman than heterosexual men. Some of the treatment methods that have been historically used to treat homosexuals have included lobotomy, hypothalamotomies, implantation of testicular tissues of heterosexual men into homosexual men, induced seizures, electric shock, behavioral methods such as different kinds of therapies. The influence of this thinking is reflected in homosexuality being classified as a form of mental illness in the first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. In the first edition of the DSM in 1952, homosexuality was classified under sociopathic personality disturbance. This was later changed classification under the category sexual deviance, which was published in 1968. However, before the publication of DSM-3, the idea of homosexuality as a deviance was being challenged widely. The African American civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the gay liberation movement between 1950s and 70s played a significant role in challenging this medical view, which led to the classification of homosexuality as a form of mental illness in 1973. In 1973, the board of the APA recommended the removal of homosexuality as a mental disorder. 58% of the 10,000 psychiatrists who voted on the issue supported the board's action, while 37% voted against it. To calm opponents, the board actually didn't remove homosexuality at first, but rather changed the wording to sexual orientation disturbance. It took two more changes, one in 1980, another 1994, under homosexuality was completely removed from the DSM. The current position of the American Psychological Association is psychologists, psychiatrists, and other mental health professionals agree that homosexuality is not an illness, a mental disorder, or an emotional problem. It was once thought to be a mental illness because mental health professionals and society had biased information. The nature of social movement is such that these often draw attention to the plight of certain marginalized sections and make visible the lived realities of people that has been hitherto silenced, invisibilized. In the case of homosexuality too, the gay rights movement visibilized the lives of the gay persons, particularly in this context, the inhumane treatment meted out to them in mental health clinics. Thus, they not only influence opinions of medical experts but also influence and were influenced by research studies related to sexuality. For instance, two significant research studies that were carried out in late 1950s and 60s played an important role in challenging the view of homosexuality as a deviance from normal. The Kinsey study and the subsequent reports in 1948 and 1953 were a major departure from the studies that viewed homosexuality as a perversion. Kinsey merely studied sexual behaviors of men and women using a survey method with 10,000 men and women and concluded that about 37% of the post-pubertal men and 20% of the post-pubertal women had had the same-sex sexual experience, and that 13% of men and 7% of women had more same-sex sexual experiences than cross-sex ones. For conducting these studies, Alfred Kinsey and his Institute for Sex Research were attacked and were termed as weakening the moral fiber of America. Kinsey's Rockefeller grant was terminated in 1954. Another study was by a psychologist, Alvin Hooker, who compared the results of projective test of 30 non-patient homosexuals and 30 non-patient heterosexuals. The study found that experienced psychologists, unaware of whose test results they were interpreting, could not distinguish between these two groups. This shift in understanding of homosexuality as a social and sexual deviance to a normal variant of human sexuality indicates that as a social attitude, these taboos undergo change through emergence of social movements, collectivization of the marginalized, termed as sexual deviance. In this case, these influence research, knowledge gathering activities, and these come together to shift scientific and medical notions of acceptable normative sexuality. Thus, the case history of medicalization of homosexuality that outlines a shift from abnormal to normal is a classic example that indicates that sex and sexuality are centrally influenced by prevailing social attitudes. The following small group exercise, again using the case example of homosexual and heterosexual, enables us to understand various aspects of social construction of sexuality. A small group stimulation exercise called Imagine This Scenario. And after reading this, the questions for reflection are: in a country and a society like this, would you be at a disadvantage? If yes, in what areas of life, and what would be the challenges you face? In this, we need to discuss family, education, occupation, forced homosexual marriage, how to find heterosexual partner, religious beliefs, conflict with law, rights as citizens, and so on. Impact on health, mental health. Which social institutions would perpetuate this disadvantaged position? Here we need to discuss the role of state, law, religion, science and medicine, education, media, family in maintaining normative structure of society in the above scenario. How would you see yourself in terms of self-image in this society? Discuss the sense of social alienation, isolation, citizenship rights, right to dignity, ability of the person to mobilize for a collective action and change. Finally, one needs to discuss the following question. Are ideas of normative sexuality socially constructed or only biologically determined? Is sexuality only about sexual acts only? Is sexuality a private matter? Sexual hierarchies and sexual value system. Charm circle and outer limit. Modern Western societies appraise sex acts according to hierarchical position and system of sexual value. Marital, reproductive heterosexuals are alone at the top of this pyramid. Clambering below are the unmarried monogamous heterosexual in couples, followed by most of the heterosexuals. Solitary sex flows ambiguously. This statement about modern Western society is made in 1980s when applied to the Indian society in the 2000 would equally ring true. While it would be tweaked in places and detail for more culturally informed nuance, in the Indian context, marriage is seen both as compulsory for all and as a duty. Marriage and procreation are necessary to establish one's social status within one's family or larger clan and community. Kinship, family ties and filial duties are significant aspects of a person's identity. The Indian family severely limits experimentation on the basis of choice of partners by adhering to the practice of arranged marriages. Thus, endogamous marriage is a normative marriage in the Indian context. Even with respect to intercaste marriage, often the structural distance between members of the two castes that intermarry is not too much in terms of the local or regional caste ranking. The compulsory nature of marriage and rules about who can marry whom are quite rigidly defined. When we apply this to the Rubin's idea of marital reproductive heterosexuals being on the top of the pyramid, we would qualify this marriage further as between two people of the same caste and same class. There would be other variables, particularly in the urban context, such as age, physical body type, education, income of the bride and the groom, with the groom being taller, older, more masculine, more educated, earning more than the bride, who would preferably be smaller, more submissive, educated but always lesser than the groom, independent but earning much less than the groom, and so on. Apart from the feminine and masculine prototype of the body, able-bodied would be another qualifier in the normative marriage. Disabled bodies that are sexual are beyond the pale of imagination in the context of normative sexuality. They certainly cannot be accorded the same status of respectability, legality, social and physical mobility, institutional support, material benefits, certificate of good mental health that can be accorded to normative marriages. The idea that certain kind of sexualities would enjoy social acceptance would be upheld by social institutions such as that of the state, law, religion, science, education, and so on, and other sexualities would be deemed as sinful, impure, abnormal, illegal, indicates that sexuality is socially constructed and that there are social sexual hierarchies based on sexual values in every society. The most acceptable, valuable form of sexuality that has been said to fall within a charm circle as described by Rubin, and then there are a range of sexualities based on various ideologies of gender binarism, heterosexism, patriarchy, ableism, casteism, and so on that fall on the outer limits of the charm circle. In fact, sexualities that lie within the charm circle and therefore fall within the definition of normative sexuality include a very restricted range of marital sexuality. We know that while being outside the charm circle and therefore outside the limits of legitimate sexuality, there exists a range of sexualities and sexual behaviors which exist on the fringes and are often invisibilized. The outermost among the outer limits would include transsexuals, transvestites, transgender persons, gay, lesbian persons, fetishists, sadomasochists, sex workers, porn models, dance performers, and so on. Even among these, there would be hierarchy. Sexualities that are part of the margins or outer limits, depending upon how far they are out from the center, are subject to a range of social controls, including silencing, invisibilizing certain sexualities, stigma, exclusion and discrimination, violence at the hands of the family, education institutions, medical establishments, media, as well as punishments through being termed as illegal under state laws. Another aspect of damned sexualities that Rubin describes is that these sexualities are often described as these monolithic singular realities devoid of any complexity and diversity. Normative sex, on the other hand, is accorded all the complexities of human experience. For example, homosexuals are described only in terms of sexual acts they engage in, and these are not only flat and thin descriptions of their lives and desires, but they are also homogeneous descriptions of the whole community of homosexuals. The other process of othering and rendering invisible the complexities of the lives of the marginalized sexualities. Weeks use the term moral panics to refer to the political movement of sex during which diffuse attitudes and fears are challenged into political action against some sexual activity or population. Political groups affiliated to the right wing and other cultural protectionists may swing into action. The media enters into the frenzy, public behaves like rabid mobs, police and legal mechanisms are activated during a tyrannical moral panic. Some examples of this in Maharashtra include the ban on the dance bars imposed by the state government in 2005, the infamous Mangalore pub attack in 2009, wherein girls at a bar in Mangalore were attacked for wearing jeans and spending time with boys sitting at a bar, which was termed as being against Indian cultural values. Moral panics thrive through evoking ideas of Bharatiya Sabhyata, Indian culture, and notions of nationhood and national pride, which need production through control of women's sexuality. In addition, there are other usual suspects such as protection of children's innocence that underline banning sex education in school. Similarly, homo-negative portrayals of homosexuals as child sexual abusers or as recruiters and converters of young children, read innocent and sexless into homosexuals, are other examples of social justification for exclusion of certain groups based on their sexual identities and orientation. What is important is that while noting and discussing sexualities within and outside the charm circle, the discussion is all about sex that is consensual in nature. It is in fact necessary for sexuality that lies within the charm circle, that is married heterosexuality. Consent may not be necessary for acceptability and normativity. There are certain points and questions for discussion that the student should take up. Some of them include: what are some of the social institutions that uphold normative sexuality? Are all the sexualities that fall outside the charm circle on an equal plane of non-normative and non-acceptability? Are there hierarchies among these in terms of the levels of acceptability and extent of punishments and negative consequences? For instance, in the context of commercial sex, is buying sex and selling sex on the same level as far as the consequences of these are concerned? In other words, do people who buy sex experience the same level of social stigma, discrimination and exclusion as those who sell sex, commercial sex workers? Do the sexual hierarchies change with context? Would it be same for a group of middle-aged men in a metropolitan city of India, a group of young college-going students in urban areas, a group of young girls from rural areas, so on? In conclusion, we could see that in this module on constructing normative sexuality, the module writer has given very interesting ways in which we could question our own understandings with regard to sexuality. This module pushes us to questions and gives us very uncomfortable questions to deal with headlong. Especially the teachers and the students could use the various group exercises given in this module. This module has also been structured in such a way that through group discussions, interactions and group-based work, the students and the teachers can collectively work out and discuss the very uncomfortable issues with regard to sexuality. Lastly, but not the least, by using many examples and through using a vast idea of literature, the module discusses her whole idea about how heteronormativity, heterosexuality, homosexuality all have been constructed and shifts our understanding over space and time. Thank you.